Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Dr. William Lee, and before you click away, I need you to stick with me for just a moment because what we're about to discuss today is probably one of the most misunderstood, heavily debated, and honestly kind of taboo topics in modern psychology and human sexuality, and that's exactly why we need to talk about it. So here's my question for you right at the start. What happens when a person has fantasies, desires, or urges that they know they can't or shouldn't act out in the real world? What happens when the gap between fantasy and reality becomes so wide that it starts affecting their mental health, their relationships, their sense of self? Well, some people are turning to something that might surprise you, something that has completely disrupted the conversation around human sexuality, fantasy, and mental health. They're turning to sex dolls. And I know that sounds crazy, I know that sounds weird, but before you judge, before you scroll away, I want you to understand that this isn't just about weird people anymore. This is a conversation about psychology, about harm reduction, about how we approach human sexuality in the 21st century. So stay with me because by the end of this video, I think you're going to have a completely different perspective on this entire phenomenon. Welcome back, guys. Let's dive deep. So let's start with the basics because I think a lot of people don't really understand what we're even talking about when we say sex dolls. Now, these aren't your grandmother's blow-up dolls from the 1970s. We're talking about sophisticated, sometimes incredibly realistic silicone figures that can cost anywhere from a few hundred to several $1,000s. These dolls have customizable features, they're anatomically detailed, and some of the newer ones even have artificial intelligence built in, which allows them to have conversations with their owners. They're heavy, they're realistic, they require maintenance, and they're designed specifically to provide a sexual and, in many cases, emotional outlet for their users. Now, according to various market research reports, the sex doll industry is worth hundreds of millions of dollars globally, and it's growing. In Japan, South Korea, and increasingly in Europe and North America, these dolls are becoming more common, more accepted, and more discussed in serious psychological and sociological circles. And here's what's really important. The people buying them aren't all stereotypical loners living in their parents' basements. We're talking about divorced men. We're talking about people with physical disabilities. We're talking about married couples who use them as part of their relationship. And we're talking about people with specific sexual interests that they recognize can't be safely explored with another human being. So let me take you to the heart of this conversation because this is where it gets really interesting from a psychological perspective. Human sexuality is complex. Fantasy is a normal, healthy part of human sexuality. In fact, psychological research consistently shows that the vast majority of people have fantasies that they never act out and never intend to act out. A man might fantasize about multiple women at once, but be completely satisfied in his monogamous relationship. A woman might fantasize about dominance or submission, but have zero desire to actually experience it in reality. A person might have fantasies that don't align with their values, their identity, or their real-world desires at all. That's all normal. That's healthy. But here's where it gets complicated. What happens when someone's fantasies are persistent, intrusive, and they feel like a threat to their well-being or to others? What happens when the gap between what you fantasize about and what you actually want in life becomes this source of shame, anxiety, or guilt? This is where the mental health conversation becomes really important. And this is where sex dolls enter the picture as what some psychologists are calling a harm reduction tool. Think about it this way. Let's say someone has persistent fantasies about a specific type of person or a specific scenario. Let's say they recognize that acting on these fantasies in the real world could be harmful, could be illegal, or could violate someone's consent. They're faced with a few options. Option one is they suppress these fantasies, which often doesn't work because suppression typically intensifies intrusive thoughts. Option two is they seek a partner who's willing to engage in these fantasies, but that requires finding someone compatible. It requires transparency and vulnerability, and it requires a partner who's actually comfortable with the same things. And option three is this new frontier. They use a sex doll as an outlet. And from a pure harm reduction perspective, there's an argument here that deserves serious consideration. If someone is never going to harm anyone with a doll, if the doll allows them to release tension and sexual energy in a controlled environment, and if having this outlet actually reduces their urge to seek out harmful scenarios in real life, then aren't we actually looking at something that could prevent real harm? Now, I'm not saying this is definitely the case. This is actually an area where we need more research, but the logic is worth examining. Let me give you a specific example to make this concrete. Imagine a man in his 50s who's been struggling with intrusive fantasies about a certain body type or age range that he recognizes he shouldn't act on. He's been dealing with this for years. He's tried therapy, he's tried medication, he's tried everything he can think of. Every day he fights these urges. He feels ashamed, he feels isolated. Then he discovers sex dolls, he purchases one. And now he has a way to address these urges in a controlled, harm-free environment. He's not cheating on his wife if he's in a relationship because the doll isn't another person. He's not exploiting anyone. He's not putting anyone at risk. He's managing his mental health in a way that might actually reduce his stress and his intrusive thoughts. From a purely psychological perspective, isn't that worth considering? Now, I need to be completely balanced here because there are legitimate concerns about sex dolls, and we need to talk about them too. The first concern is that some people argue that using a sex doll could reinforce problematic fantasies rather than reduce them. The idea is that every time you engage with the doll, you're strengthening the neural pathways associated with those fantasies, which could actually increase the likelihood that you'll eventually want to act them out in reality. This is a concern that's rooted in learning theory and conditioning, and it's not completely unfounded. But here's the thing. The research on this is actually mixed. Some studies suggest that fantasy outlets can be cathartic and help reduce real-world behavior, while other research suggests the opposite. And this is exactly why we need more robust, long-term studies specifically on sex doll users before we make broad claims either way. The second major concern is about objectification. Critics argue that sex dolls, especially those designed to look very young or those with specific racial features, contribute to a culture of objectification and dehumanization. They argue that engaging with an object designed to look like a person could train someone's brain to see actual people in similar categories as objects rather than as human beings with agency and rights. This is actually a serious concern, and it's one that deserves philosophical consideration. However, I would also argue that the existence of objectification in doll form doesn't necessarily create objectification in the user's mind if they already have healthy relationship skills and respect for actual people. A person can compartmentalize. A person can understand the difference between a doll and a human being. The third concern is about social isolation and relationship avoidance. Some people worry that sex dolls could become a substitute for human connection and intimacy, allowing people to avoid the hard work of building real relationships. And here's where I think there's actually something worth worrying about. If a sex doll becomes someone's only source of sexual expression and emotional intimacy, that is a problem. That person is missing out on the depth, the reciprocity, the growth that comes from human relationships. But is a sex doll the cause of that isolation or a symptom of it? Usually, I'd argue it's a symptom. The isolation came first. The doll is what someone turns to when they're struggling to form human connections, not necessarily what creates that struggle. Now let's talk about the psychological profile of sex doll users, because I think there are some important distinctions we need to make here. According to interviews and preliminary research, sex doll users aren't a monolithic group. You've got several distinct categories. First, you have men with disabilities, particularly spinal cord injuries or other conditions that affect sexual function or mobility. For these men, a sex doll can be a way to maintain sexual expression and satisfaction when partnered sex isn't possible or is very difficult. That's a legitimate medical application, in my opinion. Then you have older men, often widowed or divorced, who find companionship and physical intimacy with a doll when they're lonely. Then you have people in long-distance relationships who use dolls to maintain sexual intimacy when their partners aren't available. And then you have people with specific sexual interests or fantasies that they prefer to explore with a doll rather than seeking out partners. What's interesting is that most research shows that sex doll users are not more likely to have criminal records or to be involved in harmful behavior than the general population. In fact, some research suggests the opposite. And that's important because a lot of the fear-based rhetoric around sex dolls assumes that they're primarily used by dangerous people for dangerous purposes, but the evidence doesn't really support that narrative. Let me talk about another angle here, because I think it's important to understand the relationship between fantasy, reality, and paraphilic interest. A paraphilia is a sexual interest that's outside the norm. And here's what's important to understand. Having a paraphilic interest doesn't make someone dangerous or bad. What makes someone dangerous is acting on a paraphilic interest in ways that harm others or violate consent. A person can have fantasies about something they would never actually do. They can have intrusive thoughts about scenarios they find morally reprehensible, and the ability to distinguish between fantasy and reality is actually a pretty fundamental aspect of mental health. Now, there's an argument that sex dolls could actually help people with paraphilic interests manage those interests in a healthy way. Instead of constantly fighting against fantasies, instead of feeling shame and guilt, instead of seeking out real partners, or worse, acting on these urges illegally or unethically, they have a contained outlet. A psychologist named David Ley has actually written about this idea of sex dolls as therapeutic tools. He's not advocating for everyone to go out and buy a doll, but he's raising the question, could they be beneficial for certain people with certain profiles? And I think that's a conversation worth having. But I also want to address the elephant in the room, and that's the elephant-shaped dolls that are specifically designed to look like children or to represent child abuse material. That's where I draw the line. That's where I think the conversation changes completely. Because at that point, we're not talking about harm reduction anymore. We're not talking about a tool that might help someone manage their fantasies. We're talking about something that normalizes child sexual abuse, that trains someone's brain to sexualize children, and that contributes to a culture where children are increasingly at risk. And I'm unequivocal about this. Childlike dolls are not a legitimate harm reduction tool. They're a problem. They're a serious problem. For adult, anatomically appropriate dolls designed for and used by consenting adults, the conversation is more nuanced. But the moment we introduce children into the conversation, the entire moral framework changes, and we have to be absolutely clear about that. Let's also talk about the relationship angle, because this is something a lot of people don't think about. Some couples are incorporating sex dolls into their relationships. Married couples, long-term partners, people in open relationships. Why? Well, for various reasons. Some couples use dolls to explore fantasies that one partner isn't interested in. Some use them to add variety and novelty to their sex life. Some use them when one partner has a lower libido than the other or is unable to engage sexually due to health issues, and some use them as part of a power dynamic where one person controls the doll and it becomes part of their sexual scenario. And here's the thing, if both partners are consenting, if they've communicated about it, if it's enhancing their relationship rather than replacing human intimacy, then I don't see a problem with that. It's actually a creative solution to some of the real challenges that couples face. Now let's get into the cultural and sociological aspects, because I think this is where the real divide is happening. In Japan, sex dolls have become increasingly normalized, particularly as a response to the country's very low birth rates and declining marriage rates. There's almost a cultural acceptance there that you wouldn't find in many Western countries. Meanwhile, in the United States and Europe, there's still a lot of shame, a lot of stigma, a lot of moral panic around the topic. And here's what I think is interesting. The moral panic often isn't based on evidence. It's based on disgust, on a sense that this is wrong because it feels wrong, because it violates our intuitions about what human sexuality should look like. But we have to be careful about that. We have to be careful about making moral judgments based purely on disgust or discomfort. History is full of examples where society was disgusted by something that was actually harmless or even beneficial. And I think we need to examine our discomfort with sex dolls and ask ourselves, is this based on evidence? Is this based on actual harm? Or is this based on the sense that sexuality and intimacy should look a certain way, and anything outside that norm makes us uncomfortable? That said, there are still legitimate reasons to be cautious about the sex doll industry and its expansion. The first is consent and the design of dolls. Some dolls are designed to resist, to say no, to be positioned in ways that simulate non-consent. And I think there's a legitimate concern that engaging with a doll designed this way could reinforce problematic attitudes about consent in the user's mind. Second, there's the issue of trafficking and exploitation in the manufacturing of dolls. Some manufacturers have poor labor practices or have sourced materials unethically. Third, there's the marketing of dolls that explicitly target vulnerable people or that explicitly encourage unhealthy relationships with the doll. And fourth, there's the issue of privacy and data, especially with AI dolls that collect user data. These are real concerns, and they deserve real attention and regulation, but they're different from the concern that sex dolls themselves are inherently bad or that all users are inherently problematic. They're concerns about how the industry operates, how dolls are marketed, and how they're used. Let me talk about alternative perspectives for a moment, because I want to give voice to the people who are genuinely concerned about this trend. Some sex-positive feminists, for example, argue that sex dolls represent the ultimate expression of male entitlement, the fantasy of a completely compliant, non-human female that exists purely for male pleasure without any agency or resistance. They argue that this reinforces problematic gender dynamics and contributes to a culture where women's consent and autonomy are undervalued. And I think there's something to that concern. If sex dolls are being used as a substitute for real relationships, and if they're reinforcing the idea that sexual partners should be completely compliant and non-demanding, then yes, that's problematic. Some religious and traditional perspectives see sex dolls as a violation of the sacred nature of human sexuality and intimacy. They argue that sexuality is meant to be between two people in a committed relationship, and that using an inanimate object is a distortion of something sacred. I don't share that perspective, but I understand it, and I respect it as a coherent ethical framework. Some harm prevention advocates worry that sex dolls could desensitize users to fantasy and that they would eventually escalate to seeking out real partners for the same fantasies, potentially putting people at risk. This is the concern about a kind of sexual escalation or addiction. And while I think this is a possibility worth monitoring, I also think the evidence so far suggests it's not inevitable or even typical. So where do I land on all of this? Here's my honest, nuanced take. Sex dolls are a complex phenomenon that deserves serious research and serious ethical consideration. I don't think they're inherently good or bad. I think they could be genuinely helpful for certain people in certain circumstances, and I think they could potentially be harmful for others depending on the individual, the doll, and the context. What I'm absolutely clear about is that we need more research. We need longitudinal studies tracking the psychological outcomes of long-term sex doll users. We need studies examining the relationship between doll use and real-world behavior. We need to understand the mechanisms by which fantasy outlets might help or harm individuals. I also think we need regulation and industry standards. We need to regulate the manufacture of dolls to ensure ethical labor practices. We need age verification and restrictions on childlike dolls. We need transparency about data collection and privacy. We need marketing standards that don't exploit vulnerable people. But I don't think we need to ban them or treat all users as though they're inherently dangerous. Most importantly, I think we need to reduce the shame and stigma around sex dolls and conversations about sexuality in general. Because shame is what prevents people from seeking help, from being honest about their struggles, from understanding themselves better. If someone is struggling with intrusive fantasies and they're too ashamed to talk to a therapist or to explore healthy outlets, that's when they become vulnerable to harmful behavior. But if they feel safe exploring their sexuality in a non-judgmental environment, if they have access to good mental health care and honest information, then they're much more likely to develop a healthy relationship with their sexuality and their fantasies. Look, I get it. The idea of sex dolls still makes a lot of people uncomfortable. It violates our intuitions about what human sexuality and relationships should look like. It challenges our assumptions about desire and intimacy, and that discomfort isn't wrong or bad, but discomfort isn't evidence. And we can hold our discomfort while still being fair-minded and evidence-based in how we think about and discuss this phenomenon. The real question isn't whether sex dolls are good or bad. The real question is, for whom might they be helpful? Under what circumstances might they contribute to harm? How do we ensure that the industry operates ethically? How do we support people who are struggling with sexuality and fantasy in a way that respects their autonomy and their dignity? And how do we build a culture where people can talk openly about sexuality without shame? Those are the questions worth focusing on. Those are the conversations worth having. So, to circle back to where we started, are sex dolls an escape or a safer outlet for dangerous fantasies? My answer is that they could be either. They could be a healthy tool for managing fantasy in certain contexts, or they could be an unhealthy avoidance of real intimacy and connection. The outcome depends on the individual, their mental health, their relationships, and their attitudes about sexuality and consent. And that's actually the most honest answer I can give you based on the current state of research and evidence. If you're using a sex doll, I hope you're doing so thoughtfully, with clear understanding of what you're trying to accomplish and how it fits into your overall mental health and well-being. If you're concerned about someone else's use of a sex doll, I'd encourage compassion and curiosity rather than judgment. And if you're struggling with fantasies or desires that you're ashamed of, I want you to know that you're not alone, that these experiences are more common than you might think, and that there's help available. Talk to a therapist. Talk to someone you trust. Don't let shame drive your decisions. Thank you so much for staying with me through this conversation. I know it wasn't an easy topic. I know a lot of you probably have strong feelings about this, and I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Do you agree with my perspective? Disagree? Do you have personal experience or knowledge about this that you're willing to share? Let's keep this conversation respectful and grounded in evidence, but let's keep it going. If you found this video helpful or thought-provoking, please like it, please subscribe, and please share it with someone you think might benefit from this perspective. As always, I'm Dr. William Lee, and I'm committed to bringing you conversations about health, psychology, and well-being that are nuanced, evidence-based, and absolutely worth having. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next video.